You're listening to Tonebenders, the Sound Designers Podcast. Let's do this.
Hey everybody, welcome to Tonebenders. I will be your host today. I am Tim Muirhead, and with me as usual is Renee Coronado. Renee, how you doing today?
I'm doing well.
I am very excited because we're talking about a film that I really fell in love with. We're talking about the excellent new film, 9 Days. It's kind of a really difficult film to explain, so my best advice to you is go out and see it immediately, because we are going to do a little bit of spoiling here. So make sure you see it before you listen to this, but make sure you see it is the most important part, because it's a really touching film that I hope gets a lot of eyeballs on it. And with us to talk about it today is Mac Smith, 9 Days Supervising Sound Editor. You know his past work on things like Tron Legacy, Rango, Avengers Endgame, and many, many more. Welcome to the show, Mac. We're glad to have you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Tim. I love your show, and I'm happy to be a part of it now.
Oh, well, luckily the people can't see me blushing after that. Also with us is Brandon Proctor. Brandon was the re-recording mixer on 9 Days. His past work includes work as a dialogue editor, mixing and supervising sound editor on films like A Quiet Place 1 and 2 and Black Panther. I'm actually going to see A Quiet Place 2 tonight, so we can't talk about that, okay? I haven't seen it yet. But Quiet Place 1 I loved, so I'm very much looking forward to the sequel. Welcome to the show, Brandon. I've never met you before. It's great to meet you.
Hey, super happy to be here. I'm excited. This is great.
Cool. So together you guys have worked a lot. You're kind of a power team now, working on films like I.O., Haunt, Columbus, and Little Evil. How did you guys step up to the plate and get involved with this picture?
The main producer of 9 Days is Jason Berman, and Brandon and I have a long relationship with Jason. He's from Mandalay, and Brandon started working with him probably over 10 years ago, is my guess, on some smaller films. And then at some point on the third or fourth film that he was sending to you, the scale started increasing. They started getting bigger. And so I jumped on board to help Brandon and sort of take over as supervising sound editor and sound designer, not stepping on Brandon's toes because he had this relationship with Jason and these various filmmakers. So we've worked on a bunch of movies, and Jason Berman produced this one as well.
Yeah. So that first film that I worked with Jason was Sheldon Candace, LUV, or Love. And that was 2012, and it went to Sundance. It's with Common, isn't that movie? It just became a thing where I'm like, I needed to have, like, basically, we kind of started off as co-supervisors. And now we just kind of went to, like, Mac, you just do it better. Like, just supervise it all. I'm here for whatever you need. And we kind of, like, we're in conversation the entire time. Like, so we're kind of working out together. But Mac just, his organization and the way he handles a team and stuff is so great. And so it basically turned into, like, Mac just started supervising the films for Jason, and then I would mix them and come in, but always available for conversations from the get-go with the filmmakers.
And this one in particular, we knew was a different kind of film from reading the script. And so, yeah, Brandon and I talked pretty early on about, okay, how do we approach this whole before life thing? What does that sound like? The whole concept of the TVs, which is in the script, but it wasn't until I saw some of the footage that I was like, oh, yeah, the TVs are going to be really a much bigger thing than I anticipated. We started talking about, and what are some of the maybe rules that we set up to do this film to make it work. Edson and Jason ended up getting the Dolby grant from Sundance to do this in Atmos. And the movie sort of already called for that, but now it was like, okay, we're definitely doing this in Atmos. How do we approach this with that in mind to really make Atmos shine in a different way than you've heard previously?
Yeah, the concept of the film, it's very contained, actually, right? There's a location or two, and that's kind of it. And then you're building this big soundscape around it. So you got the script way before you saw a cut. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was actually before they started shooting.
So what's your process when you get a script in?
I read it from front to back, bend the corner down, or make little pencil marks of, like, this is something I need to come back to think about. Here's a potential sound opportunity. Sometimes it's something that I talk to the filmmaker of, like, hey, I don't know what you have in mind here, but it'd be cool if you really keep sound in mind in this moment and sort of try to keep those openings for us. I didn't have that opportunity really on this one because everything was moving so fast. So I read the script, and then they were pretty much shooting right away. There was no way to get Edson on the phone for a call But, I kind of knew that they were going to do their thing in Utah. They shot, the whole film there. Just look forward to seeing how they pulled it off.
Sometimes it's just asking, like, make sure you get enough coverage. If you want to like sell this moment, maybe shoot the scene, a little more extensively. Make sure you can, somebody throws a rock and you need to hear it go off in the bushes or something for some reason, not in this film, but just a film, make sure you shoot it going into the bushes or something, not just the guy throwing the rock, that kind of stuff, because sometimes they don't get the coverage and you're like, oh, can you make it sound a certain way? I'm like, we can, but I need the visual to kind of help sell it. It's not just an audio thing at that point.
And if you have people talking from front to back, like there's no space to put in those things that sound can help evoke.
They're setting up the scene like there's music, and they're setting like, show us the turntable, show us the radio, show us something that we can kind of help sell, the sound of it. If you want to evoke that feeling, it's not just like, where's that music coming from? We can kind of maybe make it a directionality thing at that point. Maybe if it's a lockdown shot, we can actually sell it better if they actually show it,
Yeah.
So when I started seeing some of the footage, I was like, okay, this is like all taking place inside this one house that's in the middle of a desert, and it's not reality. And like, what do we do? What does that sound like? Because, oftentimes when you're dealing with, a lot of interiors of a house, it's like, well, what are all the sounds that are happening outside? Are there cars driving by? Are there people? None of that was available in this movie, because this house is in the middle of nowhere, and it's on a different plane of existence. It's before life. And then thinking, like, what does Will's house sound like outside of the whole TV concept? Like, what do we make that house sound like? And really thinking about his character, that he's this character that has the weight of the universe kind of on his shoulders. And you can tell that he's somewhat depressed and feels he has all this responsibility. So we talked about, like, let's make the house sound heavy. Let's not just have room tones, but let's have all these sort of heavy drones and elements in there. We'll keep them subtle, but that kind of like sets up how Will feels a little bit oppressed. And then Brandon came up with the idea of like, well, let's in the house, like have all those ambiances just on the screen. Let's not put any in the surrounds. Let's have it all stick to the screen. So then when we get to these moments later in the film, the moments where the characters go into a different part of the house that you didn't see before, into this big space and have these moments, then we can really open up the sound field and utilize Atmos in a really spectacular way that hasn't been heard for the first, 45 minutes of the film. So suddenly there's like this definite contrast that suddenly like everything opens up.
Well, the TVs already have that kind of, the TVs in the movie, they already have this kind of dimensionality of just placement, But then when we actually go into any of these environments, or even the DIY versions of these environments, that's where life kind of comes alive, and we can just use the entire room to kind of get us into it.
Yeah, the version I watched was a screener, and I watched it on my stereo rig at the house, so I cannot wait to actually experience the thing in Atmos properly. And the other thing that really struck me was that it's all like from a production design, very analog. You got the cathode ray, televisions, and you've got him like physically like writing on a notepad and analog tape decks and all of that. I'm sure that aesthetic was also discussed as you guys came in.
Definitely. Edson was very particular about the VCRs, how they had to sound really correct.
This is the director.
He grew up in Brazil. I think he's probably about 10 or 15 years younger than we are. But I definitely, as a sort of kid born in the mid 70s and growing up in the 80s, had lots of VCRs and was always recording. So those sounds are definitely like imprinted in my brain. So I was going through all the VCR sounds in our library and picking out bits and playing them for Edson and making sure they were right. One of the interesting things though is I went to New York for a spotting session. This would have been November of 2019 to meet with Edson and Michael Taylor, one of the picture editors. They were working at Goldcrest in New York. So I showed up. We ended up just talking like for the first hour, not even watching any bits of the film. I had seen it prior and had notes, but we were just talking about philosophy and life and what does life mean and all these things. And those conversations end up being just really informative when it comes to approaching a film like this. Because we didn't have a lot of time. It was not a luxurious schedule. We had a small crew, and the whole, TV wall was super daunting for me to figure out, like, how do we do that? But as the more and more conversations we had, Edson was really open to, like, I want the TVs to represent life and the beauty of life. And so, but we have to have different emotions on the TVs. And he wasn't exactly certain of how he wanted to accomplish that. But I just, started exploring, like, well, obviously we can put sound effects of people doing everyday life things on the TVs, but voices are important. And he said, absolutely. And the TVs are supposed to represent, they don't really explain this in the film, but they represent lives that are all within the same sort of slice of Earth. So it's lives in North America, Central America, and South America, because they all sort of wake up and go to bed around the same time. So we needed to incorporate voices on the TVs that were not just English, but also Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. We set up a loop group session to happen at Goldcrest, a couple months later, where we ended up having 2 days where we had one day that was kids and people who spoke Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese, and then the next day was all English speakers. And normally for loop group, you're watching what's happening on the screen, and you're telling those actors, like, okay, do the voices of those people, in the back of the restaurant that are talking there, or this specific line on the PA at a bus station. But this was almost like sound effects recording, where it was just like gathering all of these characteristics and emotions from people. So we had this giant library in the end of different snippets of people yelling at their kids, kids going, Mom, where's my such and such? I need my backpack for school, to, people in love and people walking through the park and talking about life and things like that. And so it was amazing to have this giant library to then utilize to put snippets in on the TVs and sort of make it all come to life.
Yeah, it's how do you make these TVs not feel like you're watching a TV show? Each one of them is a different life. And so it was a challenge to kind of have that, like, okay, these are real lives, and how do we make them feel not like a bunch of TV shows? Does it sound like a laugh track? There's laughter in there, of course, but you got to have all these. Maybe they're listening to music, maybe they're listening, whatever they're doing, they're riding a bike, there's all these different elements. I mean, at one point we talked about doing lots of different types of futzes, and they'd all have a different type of futz, and that almost made it feel more TV again. It was actually better if they were just kind of like a more unified futz in a way, and not to kind of get in the way. The futz almost gets in the way, of telling that story.
The other thing that you had to deal with as a mixer was directing focus, because sometimes you'd see, 15 TVs up, and we needed to direct the eye to the one specific thing that we need to pay attention to.
Totally.
So how did you approach that?
Kind of like music in a way, like what instrument's soloing, it's you kind of have to, the TVs almost become an ensemble, and they're all kind of doing their thing. And then at some point you need to pull out the lead, the whatever needs to be the solo part of it. Because the TVs are kind of a character in itself, and then each TV is also a character, and then some of them are actually characters that are really in the movie. So it's kind of complicated philosophically, just kind of we were talking about it. But it's kind of like a choir of TVs, and then someone's going to have their solo, and then you kind of listen to that one TV, and then maybe the camera movement helps you get into it as well, because there are real things happening on the TV that we need to pay attention to, that are helping to tell the story of the film. With that, it's complicated. I mean, the technical side of it's complicated in a way. Creatively, we needed to make sure we really were helping tell that story.
I'm interested in the technical side too. Like, how did you organize yourself?
That was a big discussion too, because we knew that each TV had to potentially have dialogue, sound effects, and music. In the picture side in the Avid, they had not done a lot of sound work on the TVs other than the hero TVs. Amanda, Louisa, Fernando. I mean, those were the ones that were sort of like very specific story-wise, but the other TVs they hadn't really done much with. And I was like, well, people might be listening to music. They might be, getting in the car and listening to music or have music playing as they're cooking or whatever. So I said, do we have access to music and what can we do there? And the music supervisor, Linda Cohen, on this film works with this company, 5 Alarm Music. And it's this database that has like 300,000 tracks of music. And they gave us access to that. And so suddenly I was diving in. David Collins, who was our sound effects editor. David's famous for working on a lot of those Star Wars stuff like Bad Batch. He's like a triple threat because he's a voice actor. He does loop group. He's a composer and he's an amazing sound designer. So I hired him to help me specifically with the TVs. So he and I were diving into 5 Alarm and finding tracks that were helping the mood at certain times. So none of that stuff had really been picked before we started working on it. And then I broached the subject in that spotting session in New York with, hey, when Will goes into his office and the door is still open, can we still have the TVs? And Edson was like, oh, I hadn't really thought of that before. And I was like, I think that would help
Definitely.
Drive some of the character and the mood because, like I said before, we couldn't put sounds of things outside because nothing was happening outside. So this was a way of sort of doing some of those things. So I had found this like track that sounded like a jazz nightclub, and I ended up putting that in when Emma first shows up. She shows up late. She's like the last one to be interviewed, and Keo brings her into the office, and you hear this like jazz track going on in the background from a TV, and Edson just got tickled because he's like, oh, it almost sounds like Emma and Will are on a date. And I didn't think it was going to like make it to the end, but it did somehow. So that was so much fun to like put all those things in there. But to go back to what you were saying of organizing, Renee, we essentially had, I think, 10 Atmos objects that within each of those objects had dialogue, music, effects for various TVs. So sometimes there were 10 objects that were spaced around in the room that represented the TVs, but all of those elements were playing through each mono Dolby Atmos object.
And those were pre-mixed from a previous session?
We made a special session just for the TV. So we had our dialogue Pro Tool session, our effects Pro Tool session, and then we had our TV session. We literally just called it TV. And each one of those objects had 24 tracks below it. And within those, it would be the English loop group or the foreign loop group. And then dialogue, effects, Foley. Every TV kind of had its own, mix going on in itself. So, and then because each one had its own, Atmos assignment, we just made up mono so we could pan that one TV anywhere we needed to. So if we go around the room, and not to try to take the viewer out too much, we wouldn't go crazy, but we could, put one if the TV's higher or lower, and then we could pan those TVs together. So it kind of made it a problem solver and a problem because it was a pain in the ass to do the M&E when we had to do that. Because now, that's why we did it all in separate tracks, so we could flip out the foreign dialogue or whatever. You just flip it out in the TV session and then lay it down. You've got your M&E, but it made it easy and hard at different times. It's just to wrangle it was just a different thing. And then when we're done, will anybody know this? The technical thing that we were trying to accomplish with it, it was so difficult to try to make these TVs sound just like lives and not, TVs. And then you're like, okay, nobody's ever going to know how hard this was. And then, you just like, okay, great, perfect. We accomplished it, I think,
And it's such a delicate film. We had to be very cautious with everything in this film because we didn't want to take away, we didn't want to make anything that was too showy and crazy. And Edson is all about, making it, he didn't want it to sound sci-fi. He wanted it to be grounded in real life. So it was, while it's a quiet film, it was a big, big challenge.
Yeah, when you're totally exposed, there's just nothing to, there's nowhere to hide. It's all out there.
There's no movement, except for when you do have TVs, that there's no carbines, there's no trees, there's no anything to kind of help hide the dialogue in a little bit or something. So we're just trying to find ways to make it work, and not take the viewer out of the situation, not to go too extreme with it.
We've talked about the TVs quite a bit here. I just want to kind of put a bow on something. We haven't talked about the opening of the film, which all takes place within a single TV. And as a viewer, the film opens and you don't know what's coming. So it takes a while before you figure it out, and then you suddenly kind of see a reflection in a window, and then it starts making sense to you. For anyone who hasn't seen it yet, the first couple minutes are kind of a supercut of a character's life from birth up until mid-20s, maybe? So how did you tackle that scene, which is very complicated, I can imagine?
Well, it actually starts before that in all the company intros. We pitched the idea of like, hey, what if we created this sort of sound design suite to like carry us into that initial like color bar shot? And it was a little bit of arm wrestling with the producers to get us to try something, but we ended up like taking all these bits with the idea of like, you know, maybe these are the sounds that are going through the wires between real life and before life. So they're like little elements of voices. They're little elements from those actual company logos that we manipulated and warped and made this whole thing that goes into the whole color bar tone. There's so much like 1K tone, that sine wave that shows up in this movie that I was like, there's no way we can just play pure 1K. Like the audience will just be like holding their ears like, oh my God, make it stop. And they had done that, on the picture side, just sort of pure 1K tone. And so I spent probably a day just trying to manipulate a sine wave in all kinds of different creative ways to have in my back pocket to put in different parts. I mean, that kind of like starts the sequence, but then, it goes into the whole super cut of Amanda and her life, which Brandon should talk about, because a lot of that is also Antonio Pinto's score that drives that.
Yeah. I mean, his score and the violin that she is playing is, of course, phenomenal. That opening has so much kind of like rich life to it, which kind of helps us when we get into the house and settle and find that kind of flat ground. I think it feels a little more flat because of how much life and how exciting that music is so amazing. I mean, it gives, every time I hear that opening, it kind of like just gives me tingles. It's amazing. Without that, you wouldn't even know it was a flat kind of house or feeling kind of dead or dull. You just expect the whole movie to be rich and exciting, at that point.
And the score also goes from score to source.
Yeah, we just, started just focusing it and basically slowly finding a way to basically futz it off the TV in a sense. Of course, it's hard to futz a violin. And we didn't go too far because it's funny, when I started futzing it more and more, you started kind of losing the energy and life of that playing. It just didn't set. So we cheated with that one a little bit more and kept it a little more full range, even though it's monoed up at that point. Anytime we kind of kept EQing it further, like, you're just losing that energy of the violin.
Did you guys try anything that you eventually discarded, like in the process of putting it all together?
I tried a whole bunch of crazy stuff on the TVs, and especially that right after that opening, Will takes the VHS tape. He goes to like his file cabinet room and he puts it away. And when he comes back, he walks across the bank of TVs and you see all the TVs going. And that was a really hard shot for me because I wanted to sell sort of the cacophony of the TVs. But I kind of quickly learned that if I was putting any sound on the TVs that wasn't identifiable, that just sounded like something weird, it was going to take people out of it. I kind of made the rule for myself, like it's got to be very recognizable sounds, like, cars starting, doors closing, water pouring, hand tools, toys, just along with the loop group and the music and all that stuff. That's kind of what ended up eventually just sort of sticking to the wall as far as the TV stuff.
And the placement of them. I mean, because you play them all at once and it does sound cacophonous. It kind of helps that, but you really can't pick out that toy or that car starting. So it'd have to be like a car start and then a toy and then a voice and then you know what I mean? And kind of like this, it's building a music concrete kind of thing, so you can get all those elements and then they kind of have to fade into each other to get to the next one.
Definitely had to have a rhythm, and it was very easy to break that rhythm. So there were certain moments where it was, Brandon started moving a couple things around. I'm like, wait, stop, hold on. Like, that one's for that TV and that one's for that. And we were able to like sort of carefully change things, but it quickly was like pulling a thread on a sweater with those TVs.
They're all kind of connected to memories. and also the TVs are that, and the VCRs and those mechanisms and all those things. Like we all had a VCR, at least at a certain age, and they all sound a little different. You know what I mean? And that's the other part of this. I think that's where the futzes didn't work either, is because we're all used to different types of futzes, and we all had a different radio or TV or something, which is always tricky in any movie. Everybody's like, that's not the way my TV sounded. So all those things had to be so specific. And Edson was so like, no, I don't like that VCR sound because it's probably not connected to a memory of his. It's not something that, it might be connected to my memory of a different VCR. Like, oh, that's really an RCA, But I think the same thing kind of goes for what's happening on those lives, the toys, the car starting, or whatever. If my dad had a Toyota Corolla, I just remember that car starting as a kid. What do we put on those that kind of everybody can kind of go on the journey and actually understand? Also, it's so easy just to have one sound take you out of the whole moment. You could have one thing like, oh, what's that? And then you lose the story, So trying to keep it exciting but not boring, it made it even more delicate in a way.
One of the sweetest moments in the whole film is the beach scene, and it's very quiet. And you start out with that shot of his feet kind of stepping on the sand. And, I'm sitting there in my living room. Kids are asleep upstairs. My wife has decided to come home from work. And she's in this kick of watching The Nanny right now.
The Fran Drescher Nanny sitcom?
And so I'm sitting here watching the feet, and I just hear Fran Drescher just honking off the iPad from the kitchen. And I'm like, babe, I love you, but you got to go upstairs so I can watch this scene.
That moment is so delicate and beautiful. And I give full credit to John Resch, who was the Foley artist, and Jason Butler, who was the Foley mixer on this, as well as Jonathan Stevens, who was the Foley editor. Edson said he wanted to hear every grain of sand under Mike's feet there. Brandon did an amazing job just, pulling everything out and really showcasing that moment. I remember having John Resch come over from the archive Foley stage when his day was wrapped, when we were in that reel, and played that moment. And he even got like a little teary-eyed watching it with, and meeting Edson for the first time. And John expressed to Edson, John Resch has worked on a million films, from, E.T., Back to the Future, Christopher Nolan. He really let Edson know, like, you've got something incredibly special here. I've worked on a ton of movies, and a lot of them are amazing, but this one is really, truly amazing. And it was really neat to see him express that to Edson.
He was like, every 10 years, there's a film that comes along that really moves me or does something. And this is it. This is the movie, that did that for me. And he was just so emotional when he was talking to Edson about it. And you could tell that his love, he just put that into his Foley too. It was pretty special.
Yeah. Was it him that did a lot of the stuff on the bicycle scene of the canvases coming in and out?
They did some of that, but a lot of that is actually production.
Really?
That you're hearing of the dollies. I think we added definitely some of the fluttering of the cloth and things like that, but most of the motion of the dollies, the metal and the wheels, is from production.
Man, that was cool.
Yeah, all those moments where you get this like, oh, we're in a warehouse or a physicality kind of thing. And then all of a sudden like, wait, no, we're there. And then you kind of pull out real fast. You're like, nope, it's all DIY. And it's super beautiful, camera work too. It's so cool.
And also in that space, it's like, it's just sort of dark. You don't see the full room. So that also gave us the opportunity to like, oh, maybe there's other stuff back there. Maybe the house just like keeps going and keeps going. And so ambience wise, thinking about, having some movement and just some very, very, very subtle sort of churning, almost like a factory. Like is Will part of this factory, this before life factory that's off screen that you can't really see, that's doing something, just, something to evoke more questions to the viewer.
We thought of stuff like, so when we're in the warehouse, like on the like sand and stuff, when he screams out at the end, that kind of breaks that place we're in. Normally you would do a different kind of reverb, but we did like a reverb on his voice that's in a warehouse to kind of help sell that idea. It's like all the things we can kind of do, like, oh, this is like wrong, but right at the same time. It's just kind of fun to mess with things and little subtle things. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to realize, that it's that kind of a reverb, but it's just things that you can do to kind of help sell those environments in subtle ways.
Yeah, and what a beautiful end scene too.
Yeah.
Like I was like straight up in tears. I was crying.
I know.
Yeah, it gets me every time at that sort of the end of the montage. Antonio's score is building and building and building and building, and like right when he like starts running out of the house and that phrase starts of his score, just like every time. And I've seen that 85, 95 times. It's hard for me to to not tear up.
And Antonio came. I mean, he's like his score. His personality is so beautiful and rich and exciting. He's all passion, like as he walks, just is in a room with people. He's amazing. But he would like just sit with me right now and say, oh, can we do this? Can we do that? He was just so into it. And so his excitement would not stop. It
was very funny because he was there through pretty much the entire final mix, and he sort of started in the back of the room, and he Brandon would hit stop, and he'd be like, oh, hey Brandon, what if we do such and such? And he's like, okay. And then like 2 days later, Antonio's sitting a little closer, like he's like one row up, and then he's directing, and by the end of the mix he's like right next to Brandon on the console, elbows on the console.
I'm gonna sit on my lap. We could do that, but literally like so close that he's like hands on me and like put his arm around me during the mix and just like, yeah, we're doing this.
We were finishing this movie like at the 11th hour for Sundance in 2020, so we had been pre-mixing over the Christmas break, and then, pretty much, hit the ground running at the beginning of January with the final, and did not have a lot of time. We did sort of put in Edson and Jason's ear, the movie sounds great, but if we had more time, we'd do a lot of little things. And luckily, after Sundance, COVID happened. It got picked up by Sony Pictures Classics, and then we did get the opportunity to go back in June of last year. Was it about a week? I think so, because then we had to make all the deliverables too. We had to make the M&E and home theater mix and all that.
Like 2 or 3 days to do stuff, and then the rest of it was mastering.
But it made all the difference for us to we almost never get that opportunity to come revisit a film months later when suddenly you have different perspective and you can come at it from a sort of more clean, like it's been on the shelf, and the things that you were super worried about you hear, and you're like, oh, those are fine, and then you catch other things, you're like, whoa, I'd never heard that before. And so it was a real joy and luxury for us to go back in and tweak some more.
Well, this one's a work of art.
Yeah, congratulations.
I want to make sure we give a shout out to Dmitry Makarov too. He was the dialogue ADR editor on this, and it's a very dialogue heavy movie, and Dmitry did a beautiful job in a short amount of time putting it all together. So that was really a joy to work with him.
That's amazing.
Well, thanks for joining us today. It was really great to talk to you, and we hope to have you on again sometime soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Renee.
Great. Thank you so much.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @TheTonebenders, and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop at Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.
If you are interested in more pro audio related content, stay tuned to hear what other members of the Audio Podcast Alliance are releasing. To learn more and find links to other shows similar to Tonebenders, go to audiopodcast.org.
Hi everyone, this is Michael Helms, host of the Location Sound Podcast. Each episode, we talk with production sound mixers, boom ops, and other film industry pros about the various aspects of recording sound on location for TV shows, features, and independent films. Our past guests have worked on projects like HBO's Veep, the Netflix series House of Cards, Discovery's Naked and Afraid, and so much more. We do talk a little tech, but then we get into the stories of working behind the scenes on set. This is the Location Sound Podcast.
Hi all, this is Becky and Susan from the Sound Girls Podcast, where we speak to audio professionals from all walks of life. Join us Tuesdays at 9 a.m. and listen to the amazing array of sound humans talk about how they got into the biz. And a few cool things, like roadie nicknames and fizzy water preferences.
You can find the Sound Girls podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as our website, soundgirls.org.